Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Housing and Community Safety Policy and Scrutiny Committee. This is a formal meeting of this committee and is either being broadcast or will be broadcast, technical issues permitting. So welcome everybody this evening. We've got a number of members and we have some officers who will be presenting reports. I'll start with apologies for absence. I've had apologies from Councillor Pavlovic and welcome to Councillor Fitzpatrick, who is subbing for Councillor Pavlovic. And if we know, apologies from Councillor Baker. The first agenda item is declarations of interest. Do any members have any interest to declare in any of the business we'll be discussing this evening? Nope. Okay, thank you. Agenda item 2, the minutes of our previous public meeting, which was held on the 18th of January. Are members happy to approve those as an accurate record? Thank you. There are just a few matters arising in the minutes it's worth covering off. Top of page 2, the final sentence of that first paragraph on page 2. Members requested more information and training on how the new system, the new housing IT system, will work, and I believe officers did circulate I think it was a YouTube video. I remember watching it, so I must have received it. And if any members haven't received that, then I'm sure if you let Dennis or Tracy know, then they can recirculate that. And then on the third paragraph down, there was a request for statistics on temporary accommodation being used to house those who'd become homeless, and I think that's been added to the Q3 monitor on page 18. And similarly, the following paragraph, there was a request for details around levels of broadband connectivity, and that's included in the Q3 monitor as well. So thank you to officers for providing that information on the back of the request of the meeting. So I shall have the novel experience of signing a set of minutes. So thank you very much. So we now come on to agenda item 3, which is public participation. We have one registered speaker for this evening's meeting, who is Ms Flick Williams, who wishes to speak in relation to agenda item 5, which is the Safer York Partnership Biannual Report. Hello, Ms Williams, can you hear me?
I can you hear me?
We can, yes. So we were struggling for a while, but we've got you. So thank you for hanging on. Okay, welcome to the meeting. Thank you for registering to speak. As I'm sure you're aware, you'll have 3 minutes to talk to the committee. So I'll hand over to you.
This report from the Counter-Terror Task Group exhibits a gaping omission. It jumps from driving an action plan to assess and mitigate to oversight of the installation of permanent HVM mitigation. So please, where is the in-between full risk assessment you have done of the whole city, bridges included? Have you in fact done one at all? Since deciding to close the foot streets to blue badge holders, the administration has hidden behind the police told us to do it. No, they didn't. They told you to do a citywide risk assessment. We have consulted a counter-terror expert of our own. Tom Parker, author of Avoiding the Terrorist Trap and a former war crimes investigator, told us this. Defensive operations are a pointless waste of money because the threat cascades. Terrorists will always find the weak link in your armour and shift focus accordingly. So all you do is move the risk geographically. But leaving aside the already well-protected Minster, the focus here is entirely the foot streets. So why is that? If you were serious about the terror threat from hostile vehicles, you would be eliminating all of them, surely, not giving the Director of Transport and other officers carte blanche to issue vehicle permits, effectively exemptions, to commercial concerns. Are you aware of a real and immediate threat to life in York? In its most recent guidance, the European Court of Human Rights says this is the standard authorities must meet for there to be a duty under Article 2, the right to life. Or is it rather, as I suspect, a case of just getting carried away with the forthcoming protect duty and the perpetual trend of this council to sidle up to be chosen as teacher's pet? For example, from your report, York has been cited as good practice for the work it has been delivered to date, and York has been instrumental in the North East being chosen as a pilot. Which brings us to proportionality. Superintendent Khan said would-be lone wolf terrorists watch and learn. Your report says 3 to 4 pose a threat at any given time, so spending 1.8 million seems a mightily disproportionate response in light of Tom Parker's advice. His final words of wisdom to our question: our budget spent on highly engineered moving barriers a cost-effective solution to this problem? No, never. It feeds the money-hungry security industrial complex. I should know. I am part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Williams, and we'll take your comments into account when we come to that agenda item. So thank you for your contribution. Okay, that concludes agenda item 3. So we now move to agenda item 4, which is the Q3 Finance and Performance Monitor. So if I hand over to Patrick Lucker, if you can introduce yourself, Patrick, and introduce the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'm Patrick Lucker. I'm the Head of Service Finance at the Council, and housing is one of the areas of, that I oversee in terms of finances. So the report that's presented to the committee covers the Monitor 3 Finance and Performance Report for Housing and Community Safety Portfolio. It uses extracts of data that was considered by Executive on the 7th of February 2022. The financial elements of the report are split between Housing General Fund, which are budgets that are funded from council tax and business rates, and also the Housing Revenue Account, which is expenditure and income funded from housing rents. Across General Fund and the HRA, we're currently forecasting that services will be able to be managed within budget. It's worth pointing out that the Housing General Fund budget of £2 million is a relatively small proportion of the overall council budget of £125 million. Paragraph 12 highlights that there is forecast lost income that has occurred due to the time taken to get void properties into a lettable standard, although that is getting slightly better. It is assumed, however, that shortfalls can be managed from reduced interest charges. From paragraph 15 onwards, the report considers the performance information for the portfolio. We've got Tracy Carter and Dennis Southall are available from the service to answer any specific queries you might have around service performance.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. So I'll now throw it open to members for any questions or comments on either the text in the report or the tables at the rear. Councillor Wells.
I'm particularly interested in the number of households with dependent children that are homeless in temporary accommodation. I know it's a snapshot figure that we've got, but do we know how long children are in temporary accommodation? Is there any figures on that?
Unfortunately, I don't have any with me. What I can advise is that we minimise families with children in bed and breakfast. So within temporary accommodation, we have what you could describe as a bit of a constant juggling act with families, and we place them as appropriately as possible. We try and avoid bed and breakfast, particularly with families with children. Our main accommodation, James House, which I hope you're aware of, has 57 self-contained units and is much more appropriate for families. So we'll get them out of bed and breakfast into there as soon as possible. People are getting let properties from James House and Crombie House as well. So as soon as a vacancy becomes available, we'll move them on. It also depends on the particular makeup of the families at any one time. For example, we've had a considerable period of time without any families with teenage children presenting as homeless. And over the last sort of month or so, we've had 3 families with teenage children. So we've had to factor that into how we manage the families across the accommodation, and then obviously onto permanent accommodation as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
But presumably somewhere there's some sort of figures about how long, on average, families, because we must know how long somebody's been waiting for permanent accommodation.
Yes, I mean, we can provide those figures. I just don't have them here now, not anticipating your question. But I'll certainly make those available.
I think
that'd be helpful.
just as context for that general trend, you're right, that it's a snapshot and that can sometimes give quite a false impression. But I think what we're seeing at the moment is actually a general increase in the call on temporary accommodation, whether that's from families or from individuals. And the composite impact of family breakdown post-COVID, and I think that's a kind of trend that has hit in many other areas as well. The rollout of universal credit, the reduction in the levels of universal credit post-COVID, and the cost of living crisis are now seeing, we're now, in terms of the initial view that we're getting, that the homeless figures that we are starting to see are increasing. Denny's doing a piece of work with other colleagues within the council to look at the impacts of that cost of living crisis and in all of its composite elements on our services and on our communities, and that's maybe something that you might want to take a look at. It's probably something that the public health scrutiny will also be looking at. So whether or not that's a piece of work you want to have a view, because it's a housing aspect to it as well as a health aspect.
Yeah, no, I think it's something that probably for the first public meeting of the municipal year, we would either as a standalone meeting of this committee or perhaps with with health. So that would be a July meeting potentially, looking at that, depending on where you've got to in terms of the work that you're doing. But I think it will present itself in, well, children and education, in all aspects. But I think particularly from the point of view of how those issues are manifesting themselves in terms of the impact on the services provided by the housing team would be sort of valuable to understand that and our response. So that would be really helpful. Thank you. Councillor Heaton.
Thank you. Just a quick one on point 15 there. Where we're looking at performance comparing favourably against benchmarks. What are the figures there we're talking about?
I think that might be the Housemark benchmarks that we've got. We are part of a local authority and housing association family of, we pay into a service to get statistical comparators, and we've got a family of benchmark organisations that we relate to within that. We're actually reviewing the performance management information for housing at the moment, because there's we are expectant that the Housing White Paper will eventually surface into a piece of legislation which will have a different approach to monitoring and inspection, and there will be some things that within that will be mandated for us to measure, and we're also looking at some measures which are therefore a bit more resident focused. They're not about counting what we do, they're counting what people think about that. So we've kind of re-engaged with benchmarking with Housemark to try and get more out of that service. During COVID, it was the data coming through wasn't particularly useful. So a lot of things it's like back to normal now, and we're starting to kind of refresh our view on it. some of the general messages we were getting through from the comparative data from Housemark was that general satisfaction levels for tenants have gone down across the country. That could be to do with the difficulty of delivering effective services during lockdown. It could also be the fact that we spent a lot more time in our houses during COVID and things that might frustrate you slightly if you're not there very often, frustrate you an awful lot when you are there. But I think we've brought an action plan to the Scrutiny Committee end of last year, and we're due to bring that back later this year. And I think as part of that, we will include some of that benchmark data so we can see what's the national trend and what's specific to York.
Thank you. And in terms of that satisfaction data, looking into point 29 there, I mean, so we're talking about having stuff that's specific to York, stuff that's a national issue. Do we have anything to hand that we can say is specific to York at this point in terms of reasons for a decline, or are we still waiting for things to come out in the wash?
I mean, the talk about surveys is obviously more general about people's perceptions of what it's like to live in York. Our specific benchmarking with Housemark is about council house tenants and their perception of the place that they live in. But there is specific measures of that within that data. It's just not presented here. As I say, we will be refreshing and bringing back probably a slightly different and amended set of measures so that we can understand that national and local picture.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Vassey.
Thank you, Chair. Are we focusing on housing, or are we also looking at Annex 1?
Both.
It's up to us. Yeah. Thank you. In which case, I'd like to start by raising the issue of the increase in hate crimes. That worries me considerably, because it seems that we're having a steady annual increase and we're struggling to deal with it. So I'd just like to hear from officers what we are doing and what you think will help us take this statistic on a downward trend, because it's very worrying to see it increase like this. And we know that we've got difficult months ahead with fuel poverty. There are all sorts of factors involved in here. So I'd just like to get a sense of what we're doing.
I'm just going to invite Jane Mowat to the table.
Thanks, Jane.
Head of Community Safety. In case you've forgotten.
Hi. So the hate crime figures are analysed on a daily basis. So within my team, we have a team of police officers who are looking at everything that's happened in the previous 24 hours, and hate crime is one of the areas that we can focus on. The majority of incidents that we see being reported are isolated individual incidents. There's no patterns or trends, which makes it very difficult to actually determine courses of action that would make a massive difference in addressing those increased numbers. However, that's not to say that we should be doing nothing with it. We've been working very closely with the communities team to put together a hate crime action plan, working with partners, working with organisations, including the voluntary sector, who are supporting a number of the protected groups. So we're really starting to increase the amount of proactive work that we're doing, in the hopes that we increase confidence in reporting again and get people to give us the detail that we need to really start to get on top of the issues and address them. Because at the moment, the incidents that we're seeing, there is so little detail, it's not giving either ourselves within the Community Safety Hub or the police sufficient information to really get a grip of what's going on. But there's no real trends, there's no patterns to it. It's not something that we can say it's specifically this area, that area, or in this location. But we do monitor those figures daily.
Thank you for that. Without wanting to sound contradictory, you say there's no trend. There is a trend and it's going up. I suppose what you're saying is we don't know why it's going up. Or is this focused on the city centre? Is it found right across the city? Do we know if it's linked to housing issues? Is there nothing that we have that will help us?
The majority of incidents that we see tend to be focused around the nighttime economy and particularly around fast food outlets. So quite often they are sort of isolated incidents of name calling. They're fairly low level. I mean, certainly anything that came to note to my team that was of a serious nature, we would be, certainly all over that. But in terms of what we're actually seeing, I would say the majority of them are related to the nighttime economy. Sometimes taxi drivers, but usually alcohol's involved. So it's something that we're working on as well with the work that we're doing in relation to the nighttime economy and how we work with the police to tackle those issues generally.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Thank you. Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Thank you. Jane, following on from that then really, can we be assured that training is an ongoing process for all staff to be able to identify the distinction between an incident and a crime? And as there become more identifiable groups within society, they are included so that even an incident of the limited or, without much information, that it is taken fairly seriously.
Yeah, so every incident is taken seriously. That's why it focuses in our daily meeting, because that's where we concentrate on the areas where we know we need to take some action. In relation to training, we're doing some work with North Yorkshire County Council through the Hate Crime Working Group to develop and deliver a package of training which we'll be rolling out. We've been doing some of that work over the last couple of years during COVID, while it hasn't, obviously been possible to deliver face-to-face training, because a lot of this we feel needs to be face-to-face, not training that's delivered via online resources. We've shared throughout COVID the links to online resources that already exist when we've been approached either by organisations or communities that are wanting some training around hate crime, but we are developing a package, and that for York is being delivered as part of our hate crime action plan, which I referred to.
Just a supplementary on that, I know at one time, a number of years ago, I worked very closely with the LGBT plus community in the control room at Fulford Road to hear and see how they were developing their 101 response. So when you say training, you're talking about the received calls that come in to the police, etc.
So the training will be made widely accessible, both internally within our organisation, within City of York Council, widely out into the county and the districts, but also to the police and our partners, and any of the voluntary sector that require it.
Thank you. So just on that, you mentioned the action plan. It'd be helpful if you could circulate details of that by email to members of the committee, just so we're cited, and obviously in conversations we have with colleagues we can highlight that. And does that include information around reporting methods? Sometimes people might see or hear things and not be always sure how to escalate it where appropriate.
It does. It's just being finalised. It's in draft format at the moment. It's just being finalised. But as soon as it's in the public domain, then I will be sharing it widely, yes.
Thank you very much. Councillor Vassie.
Thank you, Chair. My second questions are about housing. I note in the report that we've previously rehearsed the difficulties that we're emerging from in terms of repairs, housing repairs, COVID and all of that. So I don't want to go into that hugely, but I think that there is a link to something else that I'd like to get your thoughts on, please. I note that in terms of energy efficiency, there's been no change over the past year. And I'd like to have your thoughts going forwards on what you think we could be doing to prepare for where we all know we're going to be in the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years, where we're if we've committed, as all the councillors around the table have committed, to a zero carbon council, a zero carbon York, that will, of necessity, involve retrofitting all our council homes. Can you give us an idea of what we're looking at to help move this agenda forwards? Because if we're agreeing a strategy in the next 5 or 6 months to deliver that zero carbon pathway, plainly we're going to need to have a sense of direction and purpose. So I'd just like to get some idea of what that direction is and how you see it working.
Yeah, in terms of the statistics that we're reporting here, that is a snapshot which is captured later in the year. I think it's September when we'll get the 2022 figure for that. So although it seems static from 18 through to 20, it was only in 2020/2021 when we took the decision to make further investment in retrofitting of council houses and launched the retrofit programme. So we've not yet seen the impact that that work has had on those statistics. So I do expect that to improve in this first year. That is very much the thin end of the wedge. It is a huge challenge. There was some interesting coverage in the media at the weekend about the level of investment required nationally to address this retrofit challenge, even to bring all houses up to EPC C rating rather than carbon neutral. The work that we're doing on the retrofit programme in terms of the investment of some of the council's HRA funding, £2 million commitment over the next 2 to 3 years, has enabled us to garner a further £5 million worth of grant funding from central government to be able to extend that, and that's both for retrofitting of council houses but also of rented properties and to support some low-income privately owned housing tenants, residents, to improve the energy efficiency of their homes. The work that we're undertaking now is that analysis of the housing archetypes and the level of carbon reduction that you can get from different interventions to different housing archetypes, and that will then come back with a strategy that will guide us on how we best invest our money. It doesn't magic up all of the money that will be needed to achieve that zero carbon by 2030, and that is a real challenge. I think we talked about it at the last scrutiny meeting. It's an investment challenge between whether you spend money on increasing the level of affordable housing, improving the condition of your existing stock, or improving the energy efficiency of your existing stock, and we are trying to balance those three financial imperatives in a way that means that we don't improve in one area but have a dreadful dilution of the impact of disinvestment in another area, and that work will be coming back in that retrofit strategy. So this figure should improve. You're just looking at a snapshot that doesn't capture what we've actually done to change that.
Thank you. Can I follow up? Thank you for that. My intuition from what I learn, and I've been lucky to sit on the pension fund committee, is that there is going to be an opportunity in the years ahead for local authorities to engage with institutional investors, with local government pension funds, in order to access the kind of funding we're talking about, because we know that if there's 7,500 council homes here and they all cost £20,000 to £30,000 to retrofit, we're talking about £250 to £300 million. And my intuition is that government is not going to be leaping to do that for us, because this problem is a national problem. Do you agree, and do you think there is stuff that we could be doing now to prepare and position ourselves towards those institutional investors in order to hit the ground running once our strategy is adopted?
Yeah, I mean, that part of the strategy isn't just, do you insulate externally, internally, in your roof or under your floor. It's about how do you capture the financial benefits of that retrofit activity to be able to fund it. So getting a circular process, and I think that becomes ever more feasible if you look at the crisis we're having around fuel costs at the moment. Something I was reading at the weekend was indicating, again, a kind of standard interwar house, if you increase the energy efficiency from a D to a C, you're saving about £500 a year in fuel costs. If you can capture that through some financial model, and that might be by an investment stream through institutional investors who want a long, safe return on investment, that they may take that by taking a share of that energy saving to be able to fund the infrastructure changes and the improvements that you need to achieve it. That is part of what we're doing in the strategy. It's not just looking at the building elements of it, it's looking at the financial models that are going to enable us to get to that target.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Fitzpatrick.
I know this will have been touched on previously by Councillor Wells and yourself and Councillor Fenton. Maybe I've missed part of this. I'm going back to the homeless households and all the things we're talking about in society at the moment and within York that are making for an impoverished society, really. And therefore, if more families with children do become homeless, I don't know whether you can answer this really. Is there a kind of joined up way of working with those families? For example, from an education perspective, I would not want to see those children have to move school because they've moved to a different part of the city, that they stay in the same area. Councillor Fenton and I are doing a scrutiny piece at the moment on holiday hunger to provide food in the holidays. Are we as a city ensuring that that these families that are falling below the threshold, if they have to move out of housing, whether it's local authority housing or other, that they can remain in their own schools? Or is that not a question that can be answered by any of you? Is there a safety net there that is helping to families in poverty, basically?
I think that's the piece of work that we were talking about, to make sure that we look at that cost of living crisis and its impacts from all angles. So from education, from social care, from public health and from our communities teams. So we've got an internal officer group about creating safer communities, and as part of the work of that team we will be looking at that issue, not just from a housing perspective, but to capture its impacts in every other respect. Whether we can solve it is another matter, but I think we've got to understand how the bits of our service all join up and how those impacts can roll through. So yeah, it's not an answer I can give you at the moment, but we're working on it.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Dennis?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. There's already an incredible amount of work that goes into making sure families keep roofs over their heads, particularly within the council housing stock. Obviously, we're part of networks like Advice York, and we work very closely with colleagues in children's services, for example, looking at specific families when they get into difficulty. So there's already an incredible lot. What we're looking to do is sort of build on that, take into account the specific circumstances that are emerging, and we'll be looking at what more we can do, and obviously we'll be putting some options for members to consider going forward about how we operate, for example, our arrears policy, what support we have available for people, how we can maximise the benefits of those networks, the grants that are available, and whether the council wants to do anything more with the existing resources that are available. And any ideas that we all have collectively about how we can do better going forward for families.
And you note that element of performance starting to manifest itself in our figures here about the percentage of rent that we are collecting, that the arrears levels are increasing quite markedly. Again, I think a combination of universal credit, fuel costs, general economic impact of COVID, all are starting to contribute there. But that kind of heat or eat question being something that you don't want to have. But it's not simple for us to be able to balance our objectives in terms of getting the rent in, to be able to fund all those other things that we've talked about, but also being mindful of the really, really huge impact that just focusing on rent collection has on people with very limited ways of addressing that problem themselves.
Thank you. Just a final question from me. We've last October, I think it was, we talked about the impact of COVID and Brexit in terms of housing repair and turnaround time on empty properties. And I'm sure it's a subject we'll return to. I just wanted to ask, given the figures in the report, are the same challenges manifesting themselves? Are there new challenges that are compounding the existing ones? What's the kind of picture in terms of where we are now compared to where we were back in October?
Voids, we've done a pilot on how to do that in a different way to really target a quicker turnaround time, and that's been really successful. So we're now looking at rolling that out, but we're also deploying our management resource in a slightly different way. So we've actually got a manager devoted to the voids process of joining together the tenants piece from the ends teams with the actual getting the repairs and the maintenance done in the intervening time through the building services team. And I hope that will start to address that problem and get both a financial advantage from that, but also more houses available for longer and earlier, which is obviously a double whammy win. I think we are experiencing other challenges around building services, the construction market, goods, services, for all of those things. That we are facing unprecedented inflation levels at the moment. So getting hold of materials, and then the prices of them have increased significantly. The availability of contractors in the market to be able to undertake works is really hard. It's a very difficult employment market out there. Wage levels are increasing. Our wage levels don't respond to that the way the market does. So we are seeing some challenges in our capital programme, which I think will come through in the next financial monitor. Dana, I don't know if you want to talk about other trends that you're seeing in housing management.
Yeah, from the housing management perspective, I suppose to couch it in simple terms, it's tough out there for people. So we do whatever we can to help people move to more affordable accommodation when they need to. Family circumstances change all the time, so you might have people who are under occupying properties. We help facilitate appropriate moves. From the point of view of letting properties, we have seen an increasing number of what we call direct lets, so where we're not using the bidding system for people to get to property. We're taking an holistic view of the family and the circumstances and moving them on appropriately. Obviously, the availability of accommodation is a key factor in that, because if we move somebody, it means that property is occupied and we can't give it to anybody else. The stock doesn't expand. Obviously, we're looking at ways to work with our colleagues with the new IT system to develop ever slicker processes for alerting around properties when they're void, for getting in there before the void, to get repairs done, to get the void period as short as possible, and to get those properties let as quickly as possible. And again, the initial signs of the new IT is that that's going to be an incredible tool in helping us do that and sharing information from one central point, whereas previously we've really struggled with that information. So it's very much a work in progress. It is a struggle, as Tracy's pointed out, around getting the staff in, getting the materials there, getting the contractors. It's a bit of a perfect storm, really, in our attempts to try and resolve some of these longer-term issues that we've got. But we think we're getting there.
Just to add on the COVID risk, we all did, the business continuity exercises around a major pandemic were all about what do you do if half your staff go off sick. That never transpired in the 2 years of COVID lockdowns. But COVID lockdown having stopped, we are now seeing that level of not half your staff, but we have got a significant number of staff who are either self-isolating or ill from COVID. And that, again, has just made everything around the implementation of the IT system at the time when you're trying to pick yourself up from a difficult period of service disruption even more difficult. Is that perfect storm? And COVID's not over yet.
Indeed. Thank you for that. Are there any last questions on this report? Councillor Bassey.
Thank you, Chair. And in a sense, we've rehearsed a lot of this, but there's an angle of it we haven't covered today, and I just want to make sure we've covered the bases. I think we'll all agree that we're very anxious about the fuel poverty that's going to be happening this year. And from a city council point of view, there's also self-evidently the impact on rental arrears that will come as a result of it. And you've spoken well about the inflation in costs of materials to repair. I just want to get a sense, I've raised this in previous meetings, and I suppose I'm trying to find out what's happened since. What we're doing in terms of communication to help people do the best they can in these circumstances. All the simple stuff. Energy efficient light bulbs, changing shower heads, switching stuff off that's not in use, thermal insulation like thick curtains. What are we doing to practically help people who are going to be, there are a lot of people later this year who are going to be facing, and maybe already facing, energy bills of £200, £300 a month. Knowing the basic stuff might seem obvious to some, but is never obvious to everyone. What are we doing, and what could we be doing better to reach out to people to help them cut their costs?
So we have a regular tenant newsletter where we will share signposting information to all the sources of helpful information. We have an approach to, say, taking the light bulbs as an example of when we're going in to do repairs and maintenance in a property, that kind of shifting to changing it to low energy light bulbs if they are not already there. That can sometimes be quite a big investment for someone who's struggling to choose between various other debts. So we're undertaking that as maintenance. I think that stuff needs to be more embedded in our strategy on retrofit, that's an approach we will take, and maybe that kind of investment in some of the low-hanging fruit on energy use. It's not always about doing the highly technical stuff. It can sometimes be the simple things. I think the point about unplugging unused devices and chargers and everything, I think we're probably all guilty of not understanding just how much energy that uses, and we're all becoming a bit more sensitive to it. Do you want to just talk about any advice that we've given them more recently?
Yes. So again, that work goes on all of the time. Being members of networks like Advice York, working with local area coordination, who've done some work around fuel poverty recently, and linking it to things like the York Talk Money Weeks that are happening periodically through the year. So it's about being joined up, about collectively sharing that information as part of a network. We can't do that individually within housing, but we're part of the networks that promotes the initiatives, and we're in on it. So we will share that information and encourage people to engage with it. And it's really, as Tracy mentioned, we are looking at some simple practical measures above and beyond what we're doing at the moment, and I'll be incorporating that into the working group. Well, I am incorporating it into the working group, which will feed into the paper that we bring later on in the year, and the initiatives that we roll out with the general approach that we take in housing, which again will be integral and linked in absolutely with the networks that are available for citizens across the city we've got some of the poorest people in the city in our housing, but we're not alone in that. So it isn't just about council housing. It is about that wider housing, the investment in the private sector stock to bring up the energy efficiency standards, which an awful lot of work is going on in that section. So hopefully I can reassure you that there's a lot of that going on. It's about how we get better, how we use things like the IT system and the information that we have around people that they're willing to share with us to enhance the offer that we have and target where we really need to target. And just make sure that in anything that we do, we take that into account, because we are in an ever emerging and evolving crisis, and we need to be conscious of that and be agile about how we respond to that.
Thank you. Briefly, yes.
Briefly respond. So I just want to make sure the bases are covered here. So, and I'm very pleased to hear everything that's just been said. It's just I'm mindful how widespread is ignorance on these issues. So I know very few people actually understand that just leaving the microwave clock ticking over all the time can cost them £10–15 a year. If they've got 5 or 6 clocks in the house, that starts to add up. And I can't tell you how many people I've met who don't understand that leaving your kettle on for half a minute longer than it needs to burns as much energy as leaving all the light bulbs on in your house all day. People don't intuitively understand these things. And I hope that in that communication we have, I know these things are said, but they need to be said again and again and again so that people take it on board and use it to help themselves. It's not a given that we understand this stuff. So I'm pleased to hear there's stuff going on, and I hope we really keep at it.
Thank you very much. No further questions. We will move on. Thank you, Patrick, Tracy and Dennis. You're free to leave, Patrick, but we'll keep Tracy and Dennis for a bit longer yet. Okay, so we now move on to agenda item 5, which is the Safe York Partnership biannual report. Are you happy where you are, Jane, or do you want to move around? It's up to you. Okay. So Jane is head of community safety, and we saw you in January where we were talking about high-risk antisocial behaviour. This report is the more sort of general overview of the work of the partnership in delivering against the components of the current strategy. So if I invite you to give an overview of the report, Jane, please.
Okay, so this is the year-end performance report for Safer York Partnership. So it covers the refreshed priorities from the strategy for 2022. It also discusses a proposed review of Safer York Partnership and also the need to be looking towards developing a new strategy for 2023 to 26. So the current priorities within the strategy are city centre crime and antisocial behaviour, counter-terrorism, domestic abuse and serious organised crime. So I'm not going to read everything, I'm just going to pick as usual the sort of highlights for you out of the report. So in relation to city centre crime and antisocial behaviour, obviously during 2021 for quite some periods of time we were still in some form of lockdown or restrictions. And then as those restrictions lifted, we saw some changes to the city centre with much of the hospitality industry opening up with an outdoor footprint. We established a city centre multi-agency roadmap to recovery group to look specifically at that and keeping a multi-agency overview on where we felt we could potentially see increases in crime and antisocial behaviour as things sort of started to return to some degrees of normality. As those restrictions lifted, we didn't really see any huge problems in the city centre, which was great. We have, however, used that time to review the public space protection order in the city centre and consultation has, I think, finished just today in relation to putting the Public Space Protection Order back in place. So that order, for the benefit of those that don't know what it means, it gives the police the ability to seize alcohol where antisocial behaviour is connected with it. So it's not aimed at people who are just having a nice quiet drink outdoors in the city. It's purely to allow them to seize alcohol where antisocial behaviour is a factor. We've also started to put back in place Operation Safari, which is our crime and antisocial behaviour associated directly with the nighttime economy group, again multi-agency led by the police, back in place, and also Operation Erase, which focuses on the sort of late afternoon, weekend antisocial behaviour. So based on the fact that we're likely to see more normal levels of activity this summer, all of those operations that we would routinely be running with the police and our partners are all back in place. We've also stood down that roadmap to recovery group because prior to COVID, we were operating a lot of that multi-agency work in conjunction with the BID through their Safe and Secure subcommittee. So we've returned to that process. So again, all of those issues will still be addressed, but with the BID sort of taking the lead around running those meetings. In February, we were pleased to be awarded the Purple Flag status for the city centre, which has again recognised the safety of the city as a place for residents and visitors to enjoy. But again, you know, it's not a time to be complacent. We need to keep that momentum going, keep that work going with our partners to ensure that we keep all of those things monitored, managed, and that we develop initiatives as and when we need to. So moving on then to counter-terrorism. So I'll cover protect and prepare first, and I'll try and pick up the issues that the speaker raised as well at the same time. So our counter-terrorism task group is a multi-agency group. It meets quarterly. It's continued to do so throughout the year. It's also following the findings from the Manchester Arena attack, we've been very mindful that a new protect duty will come into force probably around mid-next year. The consultation for that duty took place in the summer of 2020-21, and the findings were published in January. The themes that came out of that were around publicly accessible locations. So a big focus around particularly those areas, those grey spaces that nobody technically owns. So it's relatively easy to work with a venue to provide security within that venue. But where you've got public spaces, it's slightly trickier. The duty will also look around some of the larger venues and make some specific recommendations for conditions to be met in relation to larger venues. And again, a lot of that is from the learning from the Manchester Arena attack. And also clearer roles and responsibilities for those who organise large events. Now, we've had a lot of involvement working with the counter-terrorism unit, regional unit, in the as that protect duty has been emerging. So we'd actually started to do a lot of this work before it has become a duty for us to do it. So we're actually ahead of the game. So in relation to the comments in the report around being at the forefront of that activity, it's because we've had our counter-terrorism task group in place since 2017. Many local authorities are just starting that process now. So because we were so far advanced in terms of partnership working to look at securing the city better, that's what's put us at the forefront. In relation to undertaking risk assessments, we undertake risk assessments on a constant basis. So initially, a risk assessment was undertaken back in 2017, and that risk assessment has been kept under review and monitored and managed in line with the national threat level. Now, the national threat level within that period of time between 2017 and now has gone up to critical at some point, It's mainly been around substantial, which is the level that it is now, but that level means that an attack is likely. In terms of how we undertook the risk assessments, we have taken the advice not only of the Counter-Terrorism North East unit, but also the national security expert from the Centre for Protection of Public Infrastructure down in London. So he visited twice. So we've undertaken a full risk assessment of the city, and it's on their advice that has drawn up the plans for the permanent measures which are being put in place. Now, I am familiar with the work of Tom Parker. Tom Parker's work is mainly around counter-terrorism policy and strategy. The work that we are undertaking in relation to the permanent security measures is specifically around hostile vehicle mitigation. Now, we're well aware that there is no intelligence to suggest that we are any more or less at risk of a hostile vehicle attack, but this is just one part of a multi-agency action plan of many parts to look at how we are addressing terrorism and the threat from terrorism within the city. So it's not the only thing that we're putting in place, and it never would be, because that would not be effective. What I can say is that other cities around us have put permanent measures in place, and when that happens, it leaves us more vulnerable, because if you are a hostile looking for somewhere to carry out a terrorist attack, you're going to look at the area that has got the least visual protection. And you've got to remember that behind the visual measures that you will actually physically see in place, there is also a lot of invisible work that goes on between ourselves, the police, and our partners in relation to how we are looking at the threat of terrorism, what that means, and the mitigation steps that we put in place. So it's a much more complex issue than just putting in place some physical security measures. So the other strand of contest is prevent. So that's around stopping people from being radicalised, potentially radicalised. So again, we've had our channel panel meeting monthly. It's well attended by our partners. Referrals have been fairly steady, reduced during 2022, but at the moment, I don't know what the true potential of COVID will have been in terms of people potentially being radicalised by online methods during that period. So we're sort of waiting to see. The Counter-Terrorism Local Profile is in draft format, so that will be signed off by the Prevent Partnership Board that covers North Yorkshire and ourselves in the next couple of weeks. And we'll then be starting to look at developing our Prevent Action Plan for the city for next year as well. Domestic abuse has also been subject of a new act last year, which placed a statutory duty on Tier 1 authorities like ourselves. So the strategic responsibility for domestic abuse has passed across to the public health team. Since that work, they've undertaken a great deal of work with North Yorkshire Police to provide a more robust data set, particularly in relation to York-specific data. A safe accommodation strategy was published in January 2022, which comes with some funding as well. And a York Domestic Abuse Local Partnership Board was established in January, which will provide the governance arrangements around that domestic abuse duty. High-risk antisocial behaviour, I won't go into a massive amount of detail because we covered a lot of that in January. But regular meetings take place throughout the week involving the neighbourhood policing inspectors. So I think I referred earlier to the daily meeting that I have with the inspectors. We also have fortnightly meetings where we assess intelligence and work with our colleagues in the police intelligence unit to look at where we potentially might need to be doing some work. And we've also reviewed the way that we address antisocial behaviour and introduced a new problem-solving model based on the SARA model, which I have described in the paper. a large part of which will be around much greater community consultation. So we've piloted in a couple of areas a process which is based on deep democracy, so it involves every aspect of the community having a voice and being able to give their views as to what's going on and how it impacts on them, and then we're using that combined with our problem-solving plans to devise strategies to then address those problems. So moving on then to the refresh, so in accordance with legislation, we've refreshed the strategy for 2022, and I've circulated that with some slight additions, nothing major because it is just a refresh, it's just focusing on where perhaps legislation has changed or where a slight change in focus is required. But obviously, throughout this sort of second half of the year, we'll be focusing around a new 3-year strategy. Now, in the mix of that, we've had notification now that there will be a review of community safety partnerships nationally. So at the moment, I don't know what the detail of that entails. I am on a Teams meeting with the Local Government Association tomorrow, where hopefully I'll find out more about that, but it's come from the Police and Crime Commissioner's review update, which contained a recommendation. I suspect it's probably being driven by the fact that community safety partnerships have been in place for over 20 years now, and we're in a very different relationship with the police and the way that we work as multi-agency problem solvers around community safety. So some of it, I guess, will be around looking at where we have other strategic boards and how they might sort of work together more closely or merge or whatever, but I'll find out more tomorrow. As always, we will be working with Mark Kahn to look at the priorities for the next 3-year strategy. I don't anticipate that they will change much. I think the new legislation will drive some of the change in there, so obviously where we have a duty to comply, then those areas will require some additional work. And similarly, we will be taking into consideration the work that's being led through the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner's Office in relation to a strategy for violence against women and girls, and include the hate crime strategy that I've referred to as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Jane, for that comprehensive run-through. Members, Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Jane, for that. Can I say at the outset that I'm very pleased that ward councillors now in the city centre, in the Guildhall ward, are part of the Safe York Partnership meetings. So thank you for that, for inviting us. I know we can't always make them, you know, it's very difficult with everyone there, but, you know, in the past when councillors weren't involved in those meetings, it was very difficult to keep tabs on exactly what was happening in our patch. So I'm pleased about that. I'm on record, as you know, the Public Space Protection Order, as saying that while in the city centre, I might well agree at weekends or whatever, excessive drinking through hen, stag parties, whatever, I can certainly see the need for that. And I do regular walkabouts with the police in the city centre. But for those, and certainly in the Clarence Street area, I know we're not talking about that, but some of those people still come into the city centre. For people with addictions, I really think that, taking alcohol from them, possibly going down the route of criminalising people with addictions is not something that I would support, but I'm on record anyway for that. Going over to the counter-terrorism bit, in a previous life when I was councillor beforehand, as you know, Jane, I was on the police authority, and I was the counter-terrorism elected member lead for that. And one of the things that happened then, and I don't know whether you're able to say whether it has happened or does happen or whether it's in secret or whatever, but we did have kind of trial runs. We did have things like over in Harrogate, for example, one day, you know, there was a dummy session. What would you do in a situation like this? And I found that quite effective. I mean, members of the SAS were there, for example, when we didn't realise who they were. But it was a whole scenario where you would learn how to deal with things in situations. So as part of all the things that are going on and risk assessments and whatever else, does that sort of thing happen so that people can gain experience?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we've introduced under the Act, which is the Action Counter-Terrorism, it's the national package of training. We've recently introduced into York Act Operational, which is an exercise-based multi-agency training session. So we had the first session in York Minster on the 29th of March, very, very well attended, and also attended by colleagues from across the county as well who wanted to see it in progress, see how it went. That is based very much around a scenario. It's run by our counter-terrorism colleagues in the counter-terrorism unit over in West Yorkshire. And again, from that, one of the things that it demonstrated was the wealth of work that has been undertaken by York Minster in terms of raising awareness and training their staff. So it was an absolutely brilliant test. We're about to run a second one on the 5th of May out at the stadium. So yes, that forms very much a part of the process, because it's all well and good to have these plans in place, but if you don't test them, you don't truly know how effective they would be if we need them. And I think, I've been quite fortunate in that I've had a lot of involvement nationally and ability to hear what it is like for those authorities where attacks have taken place and they have had to go through a court process. And certainly everything that is undertaken, decision-making, the audit trail is absolutely crucial. Which again is one of the reasons why we've really, really worked hard to make sure that in terms of where we're at in preparation for that duty, we are really well placed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I just say as well that following and thinking about York in the wider sense, but safer communities, following the very tragic circumstances of the murder and deaths in the Guildhall ward, in the Groves. I am pleased that a review of City of York's lessons to be learnt is taking place, and I know you've taken responsibility for that, Jane, and we will all contribute to that, because at that point in time and right at the beginning, the fact that the Guildhall ward city centre sits between two policing teams was extremely difficult to try and work around, and I'm very pleased that Superintendent Khan is doing what he can now to pull the Guildhall ward together under one team so that we can respond quicker. So thank you for your role in that.
Thank you. Councillor Wells.
Thank you. I was going to ask, with regards to counter-terrorism, if there had been a York-specific risk assessment, but I think you've already answered that and said there has been. When you were talking about permanent barriers, I got the impression, and I could be wrong, that one of the reasons that we've got them is because other cities are getting them, and if we didn't have them, we were more prone. Is that?
It's not a primary reason, no. I mean, based on national and regional advice, we need to protect the spaces where we see crowds. And with York being a major tourist destination, our 9 million tourists that come through on average in a year, we have lots of crowded spaces within the city centre. We have a lot of events take place within the city centre, so we have to protect those spaces.
But what I don't understand, though, is why other towns in North Yorkshire, like Scarborough, that is absolutely packed, bank holidays and everything, and Leeds, will they have the same?
Yes. Yes, so Leeds have already put some measures in place. Scarborough are looking at it at the moment. So at the moment, because everybody is sort of gearing up to be prepared for the Protect duty, which will have quite a focus around open spaces, all of the authorities across North Yorkshire are looking at this as well. We just happen to be slightly ahead of North Yorkshire, but behind some of the other major cities in the UK.
And in terms of, you might not be able to answer this, and I understand if you can't, what is the perceived threat in York? Is it, for example, a car bomb, or is it somebody coming into a lone wolf, I think they're called?
The current, since the first attacks took place, and there was quite a spate of attacks in 2017, there were attacks that we know about involving vehicles in relation to Christmas markets, etc., in Europe. So all of that intelligence picture is analysed constantly. So that's going on all of the time. Now, nobody can ever predict when an attack will take place or where it will take place. So as part of the work, you've got to be attuned to the various methods that are used, make sure that you've got measures in place to mitigate the risk of that method being used within the city, which is why, I can't stress enough that those permanent measures, the visual measures that you will see in the city centre, are just one part of a much, much bigger plan. Now, the details of how that all works, unfortunately, I can't share because it's restricted information, but partners work very, very closely to look at the risk levels, and we base that on the advice and guidance that we're provided nationally and also regionally, and then we look at what we need to be putting in place to mitigate that risk, and that is quite a vast package involving all sorts of both covert solutions and overt ones that you will actually physically see taking place.
Okay. Is it a follow-on question, Councillor Eaton? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. You mentioned there were other cities around, Leeds, you mentioned, that have already gone into these. What other cities around us have already put these sorts of measures in place?
So Leeds have, Newcastle have, Manchester has, obviously, London has. I mean, any major city is vulnerable to an attack taking place. So most cities have protected their central areas, the areas that are most busy within that locality, with some physical measures of some sort.
Okay, thank you.
So, Councillor Hollier, is it a follow-on question? Okay.
Thanks, Chair. I've seen some press releases today from the Labour group about North Yorkshire Police saying there's no sort of specific threat. And on that basis, they'd remove the hostile vehicle mitigation measures should they be elected next year. I do wonder whether there's a bit of confusion, perhaps, about how you would define a specific threat. I guess in this case, it's taken to mean a sort of acknowledged sort of idea of a threat, rather than perhaps the police thinking more about they've got some people they're keeping an eye on, or they've got wind of a sort of specific attack that might take place. I don't know whether you could clear up perhaps some of that confusion that might exist about the terminology as specific threats.
Yeah, so it simply is not possible. Nobody is able to predict precisely when, where or how an attack, or by whom, will take place. Because if we could, no attacks would ever take place. However, we know, because of the national threat level being set at substantial, that an attack is likely. We know that we are a city that has a high footfall, so we know that we are vulnerable to an attack. Now, I suspect that the comment, and I wasn't there when it was said, but I suspect the comment made by Superintendent Khan was that we don't have any specific intelligence to suggest that an attack's going to take place tonight, tomorrow, next week, 3 weeks on Friday. But we need to be putting measures in place to prevent an attack taking place at any time. And as I say, again, it's not just about those physical measures. That is one small part of a much, much bigger and more complex plan that involves lots of things, from training and awareness raising to all sorts of other activities that we deliver alongside the police, and also with the support of regional counter-terrorism police as well.
Supplementary, Councillor Heaton.
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned national threat level. I remember this sort of coming into my consciousness around when I was about 13 after 9/11 and all that coming in. When we're looking at national threat level, is it across the whole nation that we're looking at? Is it that broad, or is there regional focus within it that we can use? So if we're looking at that threat, could it be equally Newcastle, Manchester, Portsmouth, for example, or London, obviously?
It's national, so the threat level is determined nationally and applies to the whole UK. It's based on rigorous analysis of intelligence at the time around things that have been disrupted. So there is disrupted activity that goes on all of the time in relation to potential terrorist attacks. Now, there is a piece of work that is being done at the moment to simplify that process because it hasn't been terribly straightforward, and there is some recognition that, a substantial attack for London London may be riskier than York or Glasgow or wherever. However, the general advice, both nationally and regionally, is that never assume that an attack won't happen. I certainly, I spoke at length to my counterpart in Salisbury after the Skripal incident took place there, the impact that had on their tourism, on the city, the footfall in the city, people's confidence within the city was significant. So, you certainly cannot ever say it won't happen here.
Thank you. Councillor Vassey.
Yes, related to that. So we're all aware that there's a national context, that government wants us to be taking this seriously. And I think most people are hugely sympathetic of that. Where there's been a problem, it has been that the focus has all been on these, and I understand the point you make that we only see the tip of the iceberg, but the focus has been on very visible measures to prevent people from moving around. Do you think that government is properly aware of the need to balance that with access for particular groups within a city? Do you think that the government would respond positively, or maybe it is or isn't, to York when it says, we're happy to put in these measures to prevent vehicles from accessing the city, but hand in glove with that, we want to be able to enable residents to still access their city, particularly those with access issues. So I suppose what I'm saying is, yes, those big barriers going in, but is government also listening to cities when they say, can we also have the money for dropped curbs, so that we're not ending up disenfranchising potentially sections of the community in order to do what government wants us to do?
Okay. I mean, obviously, in terms of the government's view on this, I can't comment on that.
Yeah.
What I can tell you in relation to York is that in all of the discussions that we've had within our Protect and Prepare group, the discussions have been looking at the impact of A, doing something, and B, doing nothing. And the conclusion that we have come to is, in order to protect the spaces within the city centre, which are constantly busy, we've got to take a view that we're putting in place protective measures to protect everybody who is there. So it doesn't matter whether you're a visitor, whether you've come, on a plane to get to York, or whether you're a local person. If you happen to be in that location at the time that a terrorist attacks, then the consequences will be exactly the same. So in all of our decision making, it has been taken with a look at proportionality, looking closely at whether or not it's practical to do things, because again, you know, we're a very old city with some real challenges around the way that the streets are configured and the way that we put things in place. We obviously have the archaeology issue as well, so you know, when you're talking about some of these measures which potentially would need to be sunk into the ground, you know that, you know, the minute we start digging anything up in York, you're opening up the likelihood of finding some remains of something interesting. So all of these considerations have had to be made. So, you know, I'm confident that the decision that we have made in terms of the protective measures which are being installed in the city centre are the right ones and proportionate to the need that we have. But again, I stress, and I'll keep stressing it, it's just one part of a much bigger picture.
Can I just follow up briefly? Yeah. I understand everything you said. My point was slightly to the left of all of that, I think. My point was that are there opportunities when we bid for funding to put in those measures, to add to those measures? Yes, we want to put an obstacle in here. Can we also, at the time we put that obstacle in, facilitate movement for people who might be unable to then access the city? So it's really to just try to understand whether there are things that, opportunities that are available that we could be making use of, or do you think we're doing everything we can and we just have to carry on pushing for this? I don't know.
Well, from my experience of bidding for government pots of money for community safety projects of various kinds, generally speaking, we have found that government departments have been much more receptive to projects which have a sort of multiple hit. So, for example, in some work that we've been doing recently around violence against women and girls and the Safer Streets initiative, some of the projects that we are implementing have got quite a lot of benefits, not just around safety of women and girls, but safety generally. And they do tend to be more receptive of that. So I would imagine that if pots of funding do become available for specific things, then, you know, generally as officers, we do have conversations around where it impacts across other service areas. So I don't see why that couldn't be included.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Heaton.
Thank you. I think it's the case that we do already have movable obstructions in the city centre. Just sort of to come back on the comment you made a few minutes ago. So the decision is essentially made on whether it's practical to put in any mitigations. Is that correct?
No, the decision is based on the advice that we're given nationally and regionally, and then we will look at how practical it is to implement all of that advice. So when you look at, you know, the advice that we're provided with in relation to many areas of the city, it just would not be practical to implement permanent HVM measures. However, that doesn't mean that we can't do other creative things to create the same effect. So, for example, you know, you will recall in the sort of early days of doing this work around 2019, we had those Lego blocks in place in various locations across the city centre. So there are things that you can do. You know, you can change your street furniture to be compliant to, you know, the impact of a vehicle at speed without it, you know, interrupting in any way, shape or form with things around you. So there are practical things that you can do. We don't act on every single piece of advice because we simply can't, because of the way that the city is structured. And also we are a city that has quite a high number of residential properties within it, and we've also got to enable those people to have access as well to their properties. But first and foremost, it's based on the terrorist threat and the advice given by the experts.
And within that, we've then got a selection made based on residents and other considerations. Right, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Fitzpatrick, then Councillor Vassey.
This afternoon I had a walk around Shambles Market with Sarah Loftus from Make It York, and we were looking at various things in the market that might be improved upon, and one of them was CCTV, and the suggestion for that came from a women's group who want to walk through the market in the evenings, you know, throughout the summer and whatever, and feel safe, and the fact that the market might be used for more activities during the evening for celebrations of various sorts and whatever. Who would be responsible? And maybe Tracy might be able to say something about this as well. Where would any money come from to provide any extra CCTV within the market? Would you suggest, would we be looking to York Bid, Make It York? Would it be the council in general, and would it be supported by Safe York Partnership? The idea of having it better lit at night for safety.
So, as I referred to earlier, we've successfully had a bid this year with the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner for Safer Streets initiative funding. So that is an ongoing funding pot at the moment, government funding, which is being made available under the Violence Against Women and Girls work. So there will be further rounds of that. And one of the things that I'm looking at for the next round, and unfortunately we don't know what the criteria of the round is until quite late in the day, but one of the things that I am working on and have already done some work with the CCTV manager to look at is the potential for getting some increased CCTV across the city.
Thank you.
So yes, that's where I would be looking at the moment.
Sorry, it would sit with Safe York Partnership then to pursue this with you rather than be looking for maybe some funding from within, you know, the council otherwise?
Not necessarily, because if the bid have got funding available or Make It York have got funding available, then, you know, why not? But certainly from my perspective, looking at CCTV, we've identified a number of locations across the city where we would like to improve the CCTV. Unfortunately, this last round of funding, it wasn't focused on CCTV, it was more focused around training and increased quality street lighting. So we've increased the street lighting in a number of locations and are about to run a series of vulnerability training events with the business community towards the end of this month and the end of May. But the next round, when that becomes available, then I would be looking again at the CCTV option.
Supplementary, Councillor Heaton.
Thank you. Yeah. Just to on slightly on that, on both lighting and CCTV. Just a plea really, as we're looking at expanding things like electric vehicle charging, which are often, we've got the hubs, but we've also got car parks. Can we make sure that that's also in consideration in terms of the lighting and CCTV so people feel safe at those points as well?
So when we looked at the Safer Streets...
Microphone.
When we looked at the Safer Streets funding this time, we did do some work around looking at the car parks. Again, it didn't meet the criteria at the time for that particular pot of funding. But that's, you know, we've got that data there, we've got that need there. So again, it's something that, you know, we will keep revisiting and pushing if we can, yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Vassey.
Thank you, yes, a supplementary. I'm not wanting to indicate that I'm opposed to what is just being said about CCTV, but I'd like to understand something. Way back in 2007, I got myself into trouble when I was on the executive before, when talk was about increasing CCTV. And I asked, does the city have a strategy? And the answer was, no, we don't. We just put them where we decide. And I was very concerned then about human rights issues and making sure that we're properly putting this in a framework where we understand the rights and responsibilities of all in relation to CCTV, and also that we're not using CCTV in a random form that might end up just pushing crime into another street. So I'd really like to know if we now have a strategy for CCTV that informs that decision-making process for the benefit of the council and for all residents.
Okay, so the legislation around how CCTV is used, the purposes that it's used for and how it's monitored and all of that is quite rigorous. So we don't undertake any installations of CCTV without considerations of the impacts of every aspect of it and seeking advice, obviously, from our legal team as well as our information compliance team around that. We have those discussions regularly now. So I would say things are probably in a very different place to where they were in 2007. Does CCTV displace things? It can do. And also, you know, we have to be mindful of the fact that it's not the answer to everything. Because, you know, some of our criminal community are quite savvy now to CCTV. So, you know, quite often when we think that we've got areas covered and we've looked back at the footage, those individuals cannot be identified. So it's not the answer to everything. It does play a part, but again, you know, it's like all of these community safety solutions. I would never view any of them in isolation. They've got to be part of a much bigger multi-agency plan that's addressing all of the aspects of that problem, because unless you do that, you just displace things around the city into other locations.
Thank you, and I think that indicates that things have moved on a lot since 2007, which is good to hear.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jane. Just one final comment from me. When it comes to the renewal of the strategy, I'm sure members of Scrutiny would be very happy to play whatever part they can in terms of feeding into the development of a new strategy. And yeah, I'm sure we may have some observations and some ideas that will be of value. So please remember us and involve us as and when you can.
Absolutely. I think, you know, my intention is to, you know, I'll be starting to have those discussions with Mark Kahn around, you know, the priorities that we need to be putting into that strategy. And then my intention is that it will come here as a draft. You know, obviously Safer York Partnership has the oversight of what that strategy looks like, because it's a multi-agency strategy. But it will come here as well for your comments to be taken into account, and your views as well, because it's important that we take on board, you know, your thoughts as well. So yeah.
I'm sure we'll have plenty of them. Okay, thank you very much, Jane, for your time and for engaging in discussion with us. So you're free to leave. Okay. So we now move on to agenda item 6, which is an update on the implementation of the replacement for North Yorkshire HomeChoice. So who would like to introduce this?
That'll be me. Okay. So I did a briefing paper on that, which I'm going to assume that people have had the opportunity to read. I'm not going to go through it in huge detail. I'll pull out the salient points. So hopefully everybody is aware that York has been part of a wider choice-based letting system and policy called North Yorkshire HomeChoice for about the last decade. We've been a lead partner, so I chair the meetings of the North Yorkshire HomeChoice Board. It's a separate legal entity in itself, and partners across the sub-region, as we call it, use that. I've detailed some of the partners. It's most of the councils, apart from Harrogate, and stock transfer organisations, and some housing associations of varying sides. There are a list of full partners which you can see on the North Yorkshire HomeChoice website. Following the executive member decision in 2018, the decision was taken to pull out of North Yorkshire HomeChoice and to operate a York-only system for various reasons. One of them linked to the introduction of the new IT system, Open Housing, which has had a phased implementation over the last few months. Some of the reasons include the difficulty in getting partners across North Yorkshire to agree to changes in the policy that York wanted to implement. We've done that in the policy that we have implemented along with open housing, and it will give us the ability to make changes locally in the future to meet the needs of the local population. With the rollout of open housing, I've put in some of the relevant dates there. We were hoping to go live with bidding on open housing from early April. That hasn't been possible for a few good reasons, one of them being some initial issues that we've had to sort out with open housing. As no doubt everybody is well aware, when you implement a new IT system, there are always some issues to iron out, and open housing has been like all of those other systems. It did replace 17 other existing systems, so you can imagine the extent and breadth of that system. COVID has had an impact, so with the removal of the measures, the team have been depleted. A couple of the team have moved on as well, unfortunately, during that period, so it has had an impact, along with the implementation timetable for open housing. The good news is that we've been working with partners within the city to secure 100% nomination rights to the properties that they have in the city, and they're happy to do that. We've got formal agreements with those 4 bigger housing associations with more stock in the city outlined in the paper, and verbal arrangements with some of the smaller ones. For example, Habinteg have got properties in single figures in the city, so very small numbers, and come up very few and far between. So that's been a real bonus, and I'll be setting up the partnership arrangements meeting following go live, so that we can develop those arrangements. We have a strong relationship with Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust, but they're not a formal partner as yet. That's an ongoing discussion with them. Obviously, that will take a decision of their board if they did want to come on board with that. But we do have a commitment to have a conversation around that going forward. And I know a number of organisations are supportive of Joseph Rowntree using the York system once it goes live. But that won't be for some time, because it will need a decision, as I've said. Where we're at the moment is that we are currently trying to process as many applications as we can, ready for go live on the 28th of this month. I've put some statistics which were based on the back end of the week before last. I haven't been able to get an update today, mainly because I haven't been at work. I'm on leave, but I can provide an update once I'm back at work. The numbers look low, sorry, and we do have a backlog. A backlog of 677 is comparable with the backlog prior to us going with open housing. So, as I've set out in the paper, there were 600 applications when we presented the impact paper to Scrutiny, and we'll be given an update on that in the coming months at the future meeting. So we're hoping to drastically reduce that with the shutdown period, which is going to be around 2 weeks between the last cycle on North Yorkshire HomeChoice has ended now, and it'll be about 2 weeks before we go live on open housing. So the team will be entirely focused on that, apart from letting properties through direct lets, which we do on a routine basis anyway. And as I've said, that's mainly to families who are accepted homeless or people needing urgent moves. So the focus is very much on meeting those in most urgent need. There are quite a lot of non-qualifiers. That's because of the changes in the policy. Again, I've put a link in which it gives you the outline policy, and obviously there are links on the site to the full policy. Those changes in the policy mainly affect people in the bronze band, and those were people who were simply just not getting housed. Part of the reason and rationale for doing this and implementing the new IT is to realise the benefits and efficiencies of that, and to put more resource into developing our other housing options to better help those people who were non-qualifying, who were just sitting in bronze band. And quite frankly, even as a measure of housing need, it's a very expensive way of measuring housing need, processing a full application for somebody. A lot of time and energy goes into that, with documents being needed to verify, on occasion, police checks and other financial checks as well needed. So the intention, just to reiterate, going forward is to try and expand in a very difficult market our housing options. Those housing options may be developing our Your Home offer. So Your Home is a lettings agency that we run. So we have a range of properties that we've managed on behalf of private landlords for quite a number of years now, very successful. I, as an example, want to look at how we can expand that. It's going to be a difficult piece of work. Other things will include utilising the private sector rented officers that we have, that even in the current market successfully get people who are coming through the rough sleeping resettlement pathway, and families coming accepted as homeless into the private rented sector, implementing things like the bond guarantee scheme that we've got. I won't go on in detail about that, because I'm sure you'll have some questions, but hopefully that gives you an overview of where we're at, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Well, I might end up making a statement rather than a question. I'd see how you feel about what I'm going to say. I'm talking about Spark at the moment, York Spark. I have been involved there on behalf of neighbours who wanted it to move. I talked to Persimmon, I talked to Max Reeves, people like that, to see if they could move them lock, stock and barrel. That wasn't going to be an option, really, because of the time frame. So really, I suppose what I'm saying is that site now, I've spoken to Nick Collins, is earmarked for housing, clearly, and social housing as opposed to affordable housing. That distinction is quite clear, I think, certainly to me, and and I'm pleased that Joseph Roundtree might come on board there. Possibly they might be involved. It's all very hypothetical at the moment, but just that distinction between you know, social housing and affordable housing anywhere, really. If you've got bits of land coming up, I don't know if Tracy has any comments on that, but they're not the same thing at all, you know, and sitting on planning committees, those of us that do, and we hear about Section 106 and contributions towards affordable, well, they're not. If you've got to pay huge service charges to whoever, to the freeholder, then that prohibits people. So sites like that, when you're talking about increasing offer, would it be for bits of land like that we can actually do something with? Would that add to the stock of housing, do you think, Tracy?
One of the strands of the housing delivery programme, as well as augmenting the volume of social rented properties in our own control, is also to use other elements of available council land to create that offer through other registered providers. So in the last executive, there were 2 sites that were identified for that use, and in the previous executive before that, there was a further one of 100% affordable next to the Clifton Without Library. So 17 to 21 Piccadilly, which is the current home of Spark, is going to be disposed of for affordable housing. Social rent refers to those properties that are rented out via ourselves. Registered providers have got access to a range of different affordable tenure mixes, and the balance of that versus financial receipt for the land value will be evaluated using a EU procurement viable what's the word? compliant, sorry, I was temporary kind of brain mix there, compliant method. So you've got to declare, because you were selling a piece of land with some requirements that we need on it, it's actually taken to be a procurement of goods and services. So we have to do it in a compliant way, and that means we've got to identify the evaluation criteria, which has got to balance the financial value and the affordability of the housing that's provided on that site, and that will happen on that site and on the other two that I referred to.
Thank you.
It doesn't really relate to the subject matter in the report, however.
I'm conscious we need to stay on with the bidding process. Do you want to come back?
Just to make the point again that, you know, affordable means different things to different people, and I'm thinking of Dennis and his clients and people that he tries to help, and, you know, I understand all you're saying, well, I think I do, Tracy, but I'm talking about to help our real housing need, those that really need it, to go back to the homeless families, all the rest of it, and I would hope that site or something along those lines can be used, because there's no reason why people like that can't live in the city. People who are homeless or families can't live in the city centre on sites like that if it can be developed in that way.
Thank you. Councillor Wells.
Thank you. The recommendations were meant to be brought to the Council's executive June, July this year, but I see that's been put back. Is there any way that Scrutiny can be involved before that? I don't know, to sort of help fit the criteria.
Which paragraph are we looking at? Sorry.
It's more about, well, like Councillor Fitzpatrick, about getting what we actually want to happen. So generally when things go to executive in the past, they then come back to scrutiny afterwards, and we look at mistakes or oversights or whatever. Then I'm wondering if there is a role for a pre-scrutiny,
yeah, I think
pre-decision scrutiny or something.
so. Obviously, so the executive met to talk about the disposal of that piece of land. There's no reason why, in a different guise, the issue can come back to scrutiny. I'm not sure how we badge it. I'm just conscious we're talking about North Yorkshire HomeChoice replacement system, and we're getting sidetracked. But that's not to say it wouldn't be appropriate to have a discussion at a future scrutiny meeting about, on the back of that decision at executive. I mean, that seems reasonable to me. If there are issues relating to that decision that we want to discuss further, I don't have a problem with that. And I'm sure we could find a suitable hook to hang it on. But anyway.
It just need, yeah, in terms of the timing, it just needs to align with when we intend to take that to market. So that we're not ready yet, because there's a bit of complexity in figuring out how you do the evaluation criteria, but it is something that Scrutiny could usefully have a view on. And it is a balancing act, so all views welcome.
Thank you. Councillor Vassey.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'd just like to have a better understanding of paragraph 7, if I could. You mentioned that all applicants are now being advised on how to apply for housing in the two respective areas. Just wanting to understand how that's working, and just a little concerned in the sense that all of us around this table will know the experience of being in a supermarket and someone suddenly says, checkout 4 is opening, please, move over to checkout 4. And then you find yourself scrambling all over again. So I'm just wondering if you could explain how all the people who are on the list are being moved over to the new process without there being problems for people who might worry about, how do I do this, I've missed the date, so on and so forth. If you could just expand a little.
Certainly. So as I've indicated there have been quite extensive communications, 4 letters to people who were registered with North Yorkshire HomeChoice from York alone, reminding them that they will need to re-register onto the open housing system, and that's what we call the process re-registration. It's a new policy, it's a new clean register, and we've encouraged people to apply to do that. That's been going on since early this year, so it's a period of 4 months up to now. We've communicated with partners across the council, with the networks, again, that we're involved in, like Advice York, to make sure that they're getting the message out to people. We've had officers in local communities available for people to do that. We've used social media. We've advertised it in the council magazines, but that focused on tenants, Open Door, and we have our partners across North Yorkshire have also written to the people in their areas who might have a local connection to York on a number of occasions to remind them to do that. More recently, we set specific members of staff physically going through a manual list of people and cross-referencing them with the new system to make sure that they have applied, and if they haven't, contacting them to find out why, whether they need any help. Obviously, starting with those in most housing need and working through that exercise has been very successful. And actually, we found that most of the people who were in our gold band on North Yorkshire HomeChoice had applied to open housing. So it would seem to me that the communications and efforts that we've put in have been pretty successful in getting the message out there and getting people across. When you come to something like bronze bands, so you've probably got people who've been on there for years and years and years. We occasionally come across people who are not even wanting housing anymore. They just haven't cancelled their application, or we haven't picked them up in reviews of the housing register. They're the people most least likely to have any prospect of getting housing through the council, to be honest with you. So the main concern has been about capturing those in the higher priority bandings, and the focus has been on getting them. As I said, going forward, obviously we want to expand our offer around housing options. It's a tight market, but we will focus resources on getting advice to those people going forward. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. So you're satisfied that there are not going to be people there suddenly thinking, I've just been overtaken by 15 full trolleys and I've gone 10 places behind in the queue, that we're not going to have disgruntled people who've slipped through the net as this process takes place, as you've described it?
I can guarantee you that there will be disgruntled people who've fallen through the net. This isn't the first time I've done a change from one system to another, and there will be. Some people might have been in hospital for a long period of time, or incarcerated in some other way. I won't mention them, but we're very flexible. If people come to us and say, I haven't been able to apply for this reason, and it's a valid reason, we will backdate their application to the date that they applied to North Yorkshire HomeChoice, and hopefully they won't be disgruntled, they'll be very happy.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you. I think this is probably an issue that, as the new system beds in, and I know that as ward councillors we get residents approaching us with frustrations or questions, and I know we try and connect them with people who are better placed than we are to offer technical advice on how they can make sure that they don't slip through the net. So it's probably something that we would sort of appreciate an update on in a few months' time when the system's gone live. We may have some of those disgruntled residents approaching us, and we can then feed back some of their disgruntledness to officers, and we can share information, and we can learn.
Yeah, in terms of system go live, we've done a very early lessons learned log on it, but most of the benefits realisation that we need to monitor will be some months down the line. So firstly, we need to iron out all the wrinkles, get all of the modules live, then assess whether or not we've realised the benefits we set out to do, and that will then inform kind of development programme for either implementation of different functionality or changing some of our processes.
Yeah.
Because it's enormously complicated, as Den said, 17 systems into one. Much of which was, very, very manually focused, spreadsheet driven. Just the data cleansing activity alone has been huge to get to this point. And we're still in that kind of refining the data, refining the processes, people getting used to using it, either that be customers or staff. It's been a monumental effort, and staff have put a lot of effort in to get us to where it is now, but it's not quite there yet.
Okay. So I think if members would agree, it's something we would want to come back and have a catch-up about it, and we're happy to be guided by you as to when would be when you can take a breath and look at what's happened and then have a discussion on how it moves forward. But thank you, and thank you to staff that are navigating their way through this, because I know it won't be easy, but it's appreciated. Okay, so move on to our final agenda item, which is Resettlement Pathway Review. I know Dennis has provided a slide pack, which, given the time, I'm going to suggest you don't talk through it page by page, but give us obviously we've got a page in the report that sets out the work that is underway and will continue. What I think would be helpful is if you can give us an overview of the resettlement pathway, the arrangements we currently have in place, and what we're looking to achieve in the next 6 to 12 months in terms of provision of that service. And obviously members can take the slide pack away and have a look at, and it may be an issue that, well, we may want to do some pre-decision scrutiny on it, but we can maybe come on to that. But if you can just give us an overview, that'd be really helpful.
Well, Dave, thank you, Chair. So from the information I provided in my briefing note, you can see the sort of timetable we're working to, and that one of the main drivers is procurement of an adult services contract, which is the adult wellbeing contract and forms part of the resettlement pathways that supports mainly single people at risk of, or actually who've been rough sleeping, and also young people as an alternative to care as well. So we're on that journey to procurement, but this exercise will also form part of the refresh of the homelessness and rough sleeping strategy, which is a legal requirement that we have, and that refresh is due for next year, so it will feed into that exercise as well. So it's multi-layered in that respect. What we're trying to do is answer some questions as part of this exercise. I've been chairing the meetings, and they've been really well attended, with up to 60 people being involved in that, with some elected members as well. We're looking to see if we can come up with a clear and bold vision for the city with regard to the resettlement pathways, which models might work best, how we take forward a range of models, and we've managed to bring in some national experts, Imogen Blood and Nicholas Please. Nicholas works for the Centre for Housing Studies and is an internationally recognised expert in this field. Thinking about the procurement and some quick wins, what are the actions that we can implement in the shorter term? So what doesn't need a procurement exercise, or what just needs some extra training or a different approach, or looking at the values that we operate by. How have we done that? We've looked at, it is a snapshot of data of 323 people. I don't think snapshot gives it justice. If I shared it with you, you'd see it certainly doesn't do it justice. So we've actually looked at who's in the pathway and got some data around the 323 people. In addition to that, hundreds of interviews with residents and staff that have been involved in that. Some really open and honest discussions. We've not been doing that. That's been done independently by a local charity. As I mentioned there, the external expertise that's come in to look at how York can maybe implement some of the measures that have been successful elsewhere nationally and internationally. Just to reiterate that we don't do badly in York already. It's about building on some of the success that we have within the system. Our rough sleeping numbers are actually very low. It's about how we prevent, how we move people on quickly, as in an approach called rapid rehousing, and when people are in need of our services, how we tailor those services to meet their needs most appropriately. Some of the emerging themes are around, you'll see a sort of matrix slide there, around sort of women, younger people, people with multiple and complex needs, and those with low-level needs. And then there are cross-cutting issues through all of those groups, which, again, I'm not going to list them, but they're in there. An example would be a trauma-informed approach. So what we found from the research is that some people are being re-traumatised because of the, for example, being in a hostile environment with some of the experiences they might have had in earlier life. And also people coming back round into the system, and how we work more effectively to prevent that. We've picked up some real ambition from the work that we do. So what would people like to see across the whole system, not just the bit that's being procured? We're talking about the whole system here. Again, just to reiterate, build on the great stuff that already exists. Some greater clarity and transparency around what's available. So making sure that when people do come into service, they know what to expect. I suppose that seems blatantly obvious, but it doesn't always happen. So what does a young person expect when they go into How Hill and start working with the staff there? What are the outcomes for them? What can they expect in the future? Some real practical stuff, but also stuff around, emotionally, how they develop, what sort of skills they'll need going forward, and how they work with systems, with organisations like charities, the council itself, etc. How we can be more consistent. So one of the themes has been people moving around within the overall system, having different workers, but wanting to retain workers, particularly if they've got a good fit with them. Quite often, those relationships are almost therapeutic in character, and how do we continue to support those people in a really positive way going forward. Some real challenges around that. As ever, better coordination and more integration of support. So, we'll all be aware that the money available for these services in the longer term and floating support, for example, is less than it used to be. So it's how we maximise what we have got. Again, I'm not going to go through everything, but a very strong theme coming out in this, and also around the work of the Human Rights Board as well, is about recognising housing as a right and not a reward, which is a great ambition, but a difficult one to live up to, given what we know about the levels of social and affordable housing that we have available to utilise for not only people within this pathway, but people in housing need more generally as well. There's stuff emerging around the accommodation profile. So again, accommodation. It's more about availability than suitability. That's probably work that will feed into investment decisions we make in the future. Looking at our existing portfolio that we utilise for the resettlement pathway, how we make best use of that, and what sort of accommodation we need in the future to best support our approach, which you will see from one of the slides is a little bit contradictory, in the sense that people are saying we want less reliance on hostel environments, but a move away from shared housing for several people, which seems very contradictory. A further option is around housing first, so that's where you provide housing as a right and then put wraparound support in, and regardless of the issues, you support people to remain there, which is an approach that we have developed over time successfully into our offer, and we want to expand it further into the future. But that has real issues around resource, not only physical assets, but also about that wraparound support to make it work. And there are also issues about making sure that communities are supported through the housing first model as well. Other themes emerging are around not handing people off. So when people come out of resettlement pathway into more permanent housing, how support can continue in the longer term. Quite often funding is time limited. So how do we overcome those barriers? How do we utilise, again, existing resources to make sure that people are appropriately supported in the longer term? And a theme that the Council is again leading nationally on, about introducing a strengths-based approach. So looking at people's strengths rather than their deficits. That's something that we've introduced into the pathway with the housing navigators. Local area coordinators are involved with some of the people as well, but that's a finite resource. How do we look to utilise the staff, the skills, the knowledge and the assets to support a strengths-based approach as well? That's a very strong theme. So that's where we're at the moment. We've had 3 of the 4 intended workshops. We've also got a finance and commissioning workshop, because there are some practicalities around if we want to do some of these ambitious things, like remunerate the staff involved more suitably. How do we get lever in the money to do that? So it's looking at organisations that can contribute and reap the benefits of a more effective resettlement pathway. So, for example, police, health, probation, etc. So we'll be having some tough conversations with those organisations in the future about how we can collectively resource these pathways and initiatives to better meet the needs of those people and reduce things like reoffending and crime and representation to homelessness and resettlement pathways. The project board meetings, which I chair, will continue, and again, final workshop on the 8th of June. So it's been a really interesting, worthwhile piece of work with some really great aspirations coming out to inform that long-term vision and strategy, but also to inform the quick wins and the procurement exercise that we need to do in the not too distant future.
Thank you very much for that whistle-stop tour of what sounds a really interesting and important piece of work. Any observations from members on what we've heard? Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Yeah, I don't want to keep us too long, really. That's really interesting and something I'm sure... I mean, I'm not normally here, I'm just subbing tonight, but the things you're talking about really resonate for me with young people, because I am, and some of my colleagues around the table sit on the Children's Services and Education Scrutiny. So, yeah, and you talk about the Human Rights Board. Well, sadly, we're not meeting at the moment, but when we were meeting, we were looking at things like NEETs, for example. We did a piece of work on that, children not in education, employment or training, who might fall through the net. So hopefully, you know, that they'll come into this too. And also some of us here are on the corporate parenting board. But of course, we're all corporate parents anyway. So we've all got that responsibility for, you know, young people in care and what might happen to them as they move on and move through. And I know you're involved at the moment with the decision makers session from the corporate parenting board, because they've had some issues about the flats that they might be allocated for the trial runs, etc., to be independent. So, yeah, lots of good things you've talked about. Just be keen to see how it progresses.
Councillor Vassey.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to start first of all by welcoming the dedication of the team and all the work you do. I think the city needs to recognise the effort that's put in, and it's great to see. Similarly to yourself, sitting on other committees, and I think that's part of the value we bring as councillors. We've been sitting looking at young people's mental health issues. And one of the issues that came up was the business of young people wanting to tell their story once, and the challenges of multi-agency approaches and people getting sucked into this situation where they have to repeat everything over and over again, which makes them feel worse and makes them feel they're not listened to. So it would just be good to hear a little bit from you about how this work that you're doing, which is clearly very much a multi-agency thing, how you avoid that problem of people having to tell their story more than once.
Yeah, that's a real challenge in any system, in any complex organisation, but it's one that I think across the council we're determined to rise to. One thing I didn't mention is this has got great synergy with the initiatives around mental health, the Northern Quarter Initiative, and developing a community-based approach to mental health. That's part of the conversation that we're having here, and how the two are interlinked, because there aren't people who use the resettlement pathway and then use mental health services. They're very much interlinked, so it's how we get the maximum benefit out of those approaches. But essentially they are about strength-based approaches, so that's about reducing the bureaucracy, not having relationships which put up barriers with people, so very much treating people as people rather than patients or clients, or tenants even. And by taking and focusing on that strength-based approach, I think you genuinely break down some of the barriers that exist around things like data protection and sharing, and building confident relationships across organisations and with the people that are using those services as well. So that's a very non-specific answer, but it's probably one that's going to get us to where we need to be in the future. At the moment, we do exist in a wider culture and system of approaches that are very much around, I want your information for my purpose and in the form that I want it. And the work that we're doing here is very much about moving away from that. So I hope that reassures you that it is an integral part of where we want to be in the future.
Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Sorry, just a slight supplementary, really, as a kind of answer to Councillor Vassey, really. I've recently sat on the panel for the appointment of the Director of Children's Services, and that was a kind of key thing, a question to all the candidates there, and certainly answered very well, and by the person who has got the post now, about that, only telling your story once for a young person, only having to do that in all contexts. And I feel assured that that is something that will be addressed and it will be looked at. And certainly the new director coming in has said that will be a priority. So it's a very key question and point you've made there. That's quite correct.
Good to hear.
Good. Okay, thank you. So in terms of the, obviously you're on doing this information gathering and having these discussions with a view to having the vision that presumably will be the spec on the back of which you'll go out to tender for the contract. So at what point would it be useful to engage with Scrutiny again? Is it when you've got the draft vision? Would that seem a suitable time to play us in?
It's going to be on quite a tight timescale from here on in. The existing contract expires in January. So to get a procurement out and completed in that timescale is going to be quite a challenge. If there is a radically different approach to what is being procured, then it will need to go to executive as well to get agreement to do that, because it's going to be a fairly big procurement, isn't it? So
the
discussion to be had with Jamila, I think, about what the route through for a decision is and what role Scrutiny could be could take in that.
Okay. Are members happy for us to endeavour to work around the timetable that will be necessarily tight? Okay, we shall endeavour to do that. Okay, so that concludes agenda item 7. Agenda item 8, work plan, it's currently blank, but I'm sure it won't remain blank. Yeah, we've got an informal meeting in June where, with who knows, a new committee. Who knows what the makeup of the committee will be after annual council, where we can have a discussion. We'll invite the executive member and officers to have a bit of a forward look and try and get an idea of where we can obviously discuss issues of interest to residents, but also try and feed in proactively to decision making that's coming up, as we have done up to now, I think relatively successfully. So if we can try and continue to do that, I think that would be a good aim to have. Any work plan related comments? No? Okay. There's no urgent business, so thank you very much for your attendance this evening and your contribution, and to our guest as well, Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Can I just say to both of you, really, and being a visitor to this committee, I sometimes think it's nice to sub on a different committee where you hear about things that you wouldn't normally hear about. So it's really, encouraging to hear you both speak and enlightening to see things from a slightly different perspective. So, I recommend subbing on different committees. It's interesting.
If time-consuming, but you're right, it really is interesting. Thank you, Dennis and Tracy, and good evening.